As much as we all want to forget 2020, I'm not quite ready to move on. It primarily has to do with the fact that I'm still working through my backlog of 2020 films, so I have a number of movies to watch before I'm ready to make my best of 2020 list. I know that it makes me much later than most people, but I'd feel at greater peace with myself if I make a list I'm satisfied with rather than rushing through it. However, one way that I am ready to look back on 2020 is by discussing the worst movies I saw last year. You might think that because 2020 was so awful that talking about horrible movies which released that year might seem like overkill. And yeah, it might be, but the way I see it is that in this case, my way of dealing with the crap is by making fun of the crap. Hopefully, the act of me talking about these movies will keep you away from them, allowing you to spend your time on more worthwhile things. On that note though, compared to years past, I have become much more selective of the new movies I watch. Life is short, and since I have nobody to answer to aside from myself, in terms of what movies I watch or don't watch, I don't feel obligated to watch movies I don't care about and wouldn't expect to be good whatsoever. That's why you won't see movies like 365 Days, The Kissing Booth 2, or The Turning on this list, because I simply did not care to waste my time on them. Every movie I watched in 2020 was one that I genuinely wanted to watch, and among those I did, the following 10 films were the worst. With that, let's get started with Number 10! 2020 was a rather dull year overall for horror films, but one movie that I hoped would transcend the weak stuff would be The Lodge. The trailers were promising at least, showcasing potent imagery and showing off performances from great young actors such as Riley Keough and Jaden Martell. But rather than being the next Hereditary, this film from the directors of Goodnight Mommy ended up being what everyone accuses indie horror of being: empty, pretentious, and dull. Despite its good graces, the film is hardly ever scary, but even worse, the story is completely dissatisfying. So much of the second act plays out with excessive filler posing as artistic attempts at horror filmmaking, and once everything comes to a head towards the climax, the film just takes a lot of lame, worthless turns. What makes this particularly upsetting for me is that The Lodge started out with a lot of potential. The only thing that bothers me more than a bad horror film is one that wastes its opportunities, and that is exactly what happened here. Number 9! This was delayed like 5 times over the course of a couple of years, and after seeing The New Mutants, I can understand why. I can't imagine how painful it must have been for director Josh Boone to see how his movie got butchered by studio executives, editors, and multiple rewrites, but the fact is that the result of all this meddling ended up in a movie that says a lot and yet is speaking to nobody. The intended effect was to create a hybrid between the horror and superhero genres, and some elements of the third act have evidence of creativity therein, but the storytelling and the rest of the movie is so stale and predictable that nothing particularly stands out. Not even the performances from the admittedly talented cast save material which never coalesces into anything memorable. As much as I dislike the idea of Disney having a complete monopoly on Marvel superhero stories on the big screen, the good thing about it is that with the X-Men being incorporated into the MCU, we hopefully won't have to deal with limp noodle X-Men movies anymore. Number 8! I'm not a huge fan of the original Witches film made by Nicholas Roeg in 1990, but I won't be the first nor the last to admit that producing a remake doesn't make much sense. The thing that makes even less sense is Robert Zemeckis directing a remake. Now, I can appreciate the choice to set the movie during the civil rights era and changing the race of the main characters to reflect this change in subtext. However, what is even more disappointing than wasting its 1960s backdrop is that the film is just a pointless, emotionally distant retread of what was already a solid film. Anne Hathaway is fine, Stanley Tucci is Stanley Tucci, so he's always great, and I love the idea of Octavia Spencer playing the grandma, but just like his equally bad adaptation of The Polar Express, yep, that's my opinion, sorry. The focus was not on reinventing a Roald Dahl story, but rather just showing off technology. Except it's weird because none of the CGI used in the film is impressive, so what does this movie really have? Oh yeah, that's right, nothing. Number 7! After failing miserably with Fat Forstick back in 2015, I hoped that Josh Trank's debut film Chronicle wasn't a fluke. But after seeing his latest movie Capone, a biopic about the infamous mob boss starring Tom Hardy, I have come to the conclusion that Chronicle was indeed a fluke. It's hard to really know what sort of angle Josh Trank approached this movie with, but I can certainly say that it was not executed gracefully or cohesively. Capone is absolutely bonkers, veering in every direction you might expect something like this to take, yet those choices choices lacked a clear vision. Even worse than its mangled form that emerged out of the editing room is that it's an awkward film to sit through, with much of the film being uncomfortably sympathetic to a horrible man, on top of focusing its time and energy on Al Capone's physical deterioration, which does include, yes, him having disgusting issues with his bowels. Some aspects of this movie were fun in a sort of what the heck am I watching kind of way, but if we're talking about Capone from the perspective of being a film of worth, well, it doesn't really have much. Number 6! The DCEU is such a royal mess of a franchise, and Wonder Woman 1984 is yet another huge miss for the folks at DC and Warner Brothers. Even though I was nowhere near as high on the original Wonder Woman as other people had been, it takes movies like its long-awaited sequel that make you appreciate what you might have taken for granted before. After all, Wonder Woman 1984 is just about one of the lamest plots I've ever witnessed in a superhero film, but even worse than that, it is completely and utterly boring. I have no idea why this movie ended up being as long as it was, because over 150 minutes of runtime can't compensate for how little the story ever comes close to being compelling, fun, and interesting. Pedro Pascal was good and the production design was nice, I suppose, but beyond that, I can hardly think of what good things I can say about this. You'd simply be better off spending your time and money on other things when it comes to HBO Max. Number 5! Given that my in-laws are huge fans of the Scooby-Doo franchise, I'm gonna get in trouble for including Scoob on this list. And hey, I'm a fan of Scooby-Doo as well, having grown up on a couple of the shows when it played on Kids WB. However, this computer-animated reboot did nothing to tickle my nostalgic fancy, but rather I felt reproach, disappointment, and disgust over what ended up being an overly cynical take on this property. I just wish that for once, movie studios would stop treating every franchise like it can be morphed into the MCU, for rather than being a genuine Scooby-Doo movie, this more or less serves as a lazy springboard for making other Hanna-Barbera movies. On top of that, the story is boring, and the jokes largely consist of terrible pop culture references that were aged as soon as they were delivered. While I like the animation style and the manner in which the film opens, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was made by some sort of executive committee, and that ultimately soured the experience for me. Number 4! DreamWorks' output in the 2010s was mostly lackluster to say the least, and so far in the 2020s, they haven't done so hot either, with Trolls World Tour being one of my least favorite movies they've done. While I never really had any hope this would be good, I was still surprised that I disliked it even more than the first Trolls, considering that there were aspects that I genuinely liked, particularly the punk rock troll and the overall look of the film, which was considerably more colorful and creative than the original. But honestly, everything else about this movie was just annoying to me. I hated the fact that it was a jukebox musical with bad covers, the characters were frustrating, the storylines felt forced, and there was simply nothing about this movie that was remotely appealing to me. I wish I could say more about my specific issues with this movie, but in the 8 months that have passed since I first watched it, my memories of it have simply left my mind. What I do remember, though, is feeling upset that it may be a long time before we get anything truly original or even just good from DreamWorks again. And Trolls World Tour was evidence that money is driving much more of their decisions rather than artistic intent. Number 3! The live-action Disney remakes are the laughingstock of the YouTube film lover community, and in 2020, Mulan became the poster child of the ongoing hate train for these creatively bankrupt projects. And believe me, I do not despise this film simply because it's the popular thing to do. Mulan is truly a horrendous mess of a movie, and even less satisfying as a live-action reimagining of a great Disney animation. Just like with Wonder Woman 1984, this is another case where I retroactively appreciate the source material, in this case being the 1998 Mulan film, more because of how poorly it was handled recently. It matters not to me that they decided to turn what was an iconic musical into a dramatic action movie, but rather I'm upset that none of the changes make any sense in the context of the movie and as a remake, nor is it a competent story regardless of context. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more bland, brain-numb, and misguided blockbuster from the past year, well, except for the last 2 entries on my list. Number 2! There was not a single movie released in 2020 that was more forgettable yet equally unforgettable as Dolittle. It's unforgettable for the fact that there are certain aspects of it that one simply cannot get out of their brain, such as the weak CGI of all the talking animals, Robert Downey Jr.'s utterly ridiculous voice, and the scene towards the end of the film where the main character has to remove something out of a dragon's rectum. That is not a joke, I am describing something that legitimately happens in this movie. But otherwise, it's forgettable because I couldn't really recount out anything else to you about this movie even if I tried. I do remember thinking that this was a painful movie to sit and experience, both for how endlessly boring it was, on top of so much of the execution being a maddening misfire of tone. I would honestly be shocked if even young kids found something to enjoy here, and if you are a teenager or adult watching this, do yourself a favor and never subject yourself to this noxious snooze fest.
You stink!
Mulan may have been a disaster, but Disney released an even worse travesty in 2020, and that was Artemis Fowl, which rightly deserves its dishonorable position as the worst movie of 2020. The one nice thing about this film is that in being dumped onto Disney Plus in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the mouse thankfully didn't charge us an extra $30 to suffer through what they knew was garbage. Otherwise, all this movie needed to do to be my least favorite film of 2020 was show me this cursed clip.
It's feeding time.
The rest of this, though, is awful in every conceivable way. I'm not even familiar with the source material, and I could tell just by watching this that those who wrote the script had no idea what they were doing, since not only is it a baboon-brained sequence of events and dialogue, it's basically a story that never happens. Even as it clocks in at less than 90 minutes, the movie is basically just an extended first act with no rising action, climax, or resolution to deliver something satisfying to its audience. On top of it being an awkward attempt at making a super cool blockbuster to begin with, the film fails because it simply screws up the fundamentals of storytelling. The only worth this movie has is that it resulted in some of my favorite YouTubers making some amazing content by just talking about how awful it is. And hey, I guess it also has worth in that it was fun to talk crap about it. Thank you for checking in to hear me talk about Artemis Fowl and other really bad movies from 2020 as well. If you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing to my channel and joining the notification squadron so that you don't miss out on my future videos, especially since I hope to get my videos about the best, most surprising, and most disappointing movies of 2020 out soon as well. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you all have a good one.